Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Andrew, a fourth-year medical student, sat on the last row of the auditorium amphitheater. Was his favorite lecture on topographical anatomy and surgical surgery. But he was not up to it, the young man, not tearing off, looking at Betty, the first beauty of the stream. So looked at the main character in the movie till Monday, the boy who wrote the poem about the crane, which again in the clouds, with admiration, adoration, and hope. And hope is necessary. That's a quote from the same movie, too. Yes. Andrew had been long and hopelessly in love with a student named Betty, his classmate. They were in their fourth year of medical school. He fell in love as soon as he saw the girl for the first time. When Andrew walked into the auditorium for the first faculty meeting, all the seats were already taken. And the girls, and there were most of them, were very attractive. But his gaze stopped immediately on Betty, and for several years he has not deviated an inch from the object of his adoration. Andrew turned out to be a one-woman man. And after almost 4 years, he even remembered what she was wearing then. Frankly, his chances were nil. For one thing, he was, to put it mildly, unsightly. A large head sat on a short neck so that it seemed to be screwed right into his torso, which was Andrew's mother's favorite word. His torso was big, but not because of muscle mass, but because of fatty deposits. Andrew was the kind of kid they gave the offensive nickname of Fatty in school. He was, but high school was over, and with it, childhood. And for advanced students, it was all in the past. We had to come up with something newer. They did not bother. Everything had already been thought up before their time. Especially since, when they met, the boy introduced himself as Andrew. That was how his mother called him at home, in a slightly rustic way. And so it went. Andrew means Andrew, though this Andrew had nothing in common with Betty except his glasses. And kind of a nickname, but kind of a diminutive of Andrew. That depends on how you look at it. The image was completed by his long, unkempt legs, which were completely out of sync with his massive chest. Oh, and big glasses. The clothes also matched the image, as they would say before. No jeans. Andrew wore his father's pants, which were the same size as his father's. Dad died a long time ago, leaving behind a pair of quality, as Mom said, pants. Since nothing was lost in the house, things had to be left behind. One could not carry almost new pants to the garbage dump. It is now fashionable modern coaches without life experience teaching raskladleniu and fashionable nowadays minimalism. One should first free the space of life from unnecessary things, and then the consciousness will free itself, and everyone will benefit. What kind? It was not specified, as in the case of new thinking and perestroika. It is necessary to think in a new way, to rebuild, and that's it. Besides, Andrew's grandmother was a blockade child, so lived, treasuring everything and every crumb. It was done by default, as they say now, and frankly the young man did not care much about images and entourage. He was quite satisfied with his appearance because he had absolutely other goals, and also self-loathing was a sin. That's what his clever grandmother had said. Therefore, the young man decided not to sin on small things, rightly believing that he might have to ask for absolution for something bigger in the future. And who cares what you're wearing? Andrew somehow immediately became the object of everyone's ridicule. Why? It is not clear. He was the best in his studies and was steadily going to red diploma. It seemed that the ridicule did not affect him. He looked at the nickname philosophically and always kept a completely unperturbed look in any situation, which in the life of a doctor meant a lot. And again, Andrew's word from the lips of the girl he loved sounded not at all offensive. It was not now, when everything was taught remotely, but a little earlier, when you had to try everything yourself, to feel a patient's lymph nodes, and determine what tissue you were given at the histology exam, and to be on duty in the hospital with all the ensuing consequences. Yes, delivered babies. That's why male doctors take better care of their wives. They know how much they get it, the bastards. If only one man could bear and give birth to an heir, he would stop talking about fishing, women, and cars. They would discuss contractions, water yield, and pushing in every detail. And they would brag not about the size of the catch, but about the height and weight of the baby. And now doctors are taught somewhat differently. And in schools, too. Now, after skipping gym class, you can get credit for it if you write an essay on any sports topic, and you don't have to work up a sweat, climbing a rope or jumping over a goat. You could do worse, but you couldn't. Besides, Andrew was from a poor family. He was brought up by his mother alone, and the dream of both her and her son was to learn to be a doctor, help people, and bring the family long-awaited prosperity. So Andrew tried his best. A humble mother helped her son as much as she could. They saved on everything. In winter, they hung out the food outside the window and turned off the fridge. They bought only the cheapest laundry detergent and gray toilet paper. There was one double-layer roll for guests. It was hung up in advance on an old toilet rail that replaced the paper holder. The dishes were washed only with laundry soap. A ton of cheap soap, bought by my prudent mother, was stored in the mezzanine, and she told everyone that she was allergic to expensive detergents. She used to grate into salads harmful cabbage sprouts, which absorbed all kinds of toxins from the soil. Nothing was lost at home. She added grated carrots and apples and got a strange dish. All the guests asked for the strictly secret recipe. She constantly spun chicken cutlets out of chicken breasts and skin on an old meat grinder, respectively, to the tune of Vysotsky's famous song about rockets and the NSI. We also make cutlets out of chicken skin and bones. In short, everyone knew it. Even the 2 stone dryers had their uses. They were grated on the same infamous grater. To the received rubbish raw yolk was added, and after careful mixing, the resulting mixture was thrown into the boiling broth in small portions. The result was delicious dumplings. And today we had some strange viands for dinner. Vegetarian cabbage soup, pancakes with meat and quiche. The meal cost nothing. By the way, my mom had no equal in making kissel. And it could not be otherwise. Since Andrew had no money for expensive cranberries and other berries, all the kissels were made from a wonderful thing. Red tea under different names. Carcade, hibiscus, oolong. It began to flood the market and become deservedly popular, as it is usually said today. It tasted a bit like the live berry, but was much cheaper. No, this is by no means an advertisement, although a good idea can be taken advantage of. You just can't do without it when describing Andrew's family. It's what they call the cherry on the cake today. This is where we should digress and say that a good hostess, and Andrew's mother was just that, should always have dinner at home. A modest one, perhaps, but always and full. Hot first, second, and compote, as in the joke. I can't vouch for the taste, but I'll make it hot. It is a great Soviet habit to cook dinner at home, not to swallow harmful pizza and rolls made of God knows what. Grandmothers who lived in socialist communal flats know that a good hostess must have 2 basic things done: the bed made and dinner ready. Otherwise, there are variations. Andrew's increased weight was due to the fact that the family's main meal was pancakes and pasta, the cheapest food. Those who were wealthier cooked pasta with any meat, mostly cutlets and cheap sausages of chemically pure pink color. The rest of us ate pasta with fried onions. Top of the line was pasta with fried onions, which was eaten with bread, and bread was always considered the food of the poor. In short, the apotheosis of poverty. Naturally, my mother had high hopes for her son. It was he who was to steer the ship of their life into an orbit of a stable and sustainable economy. Therefore, for his birthday, she gave him Sinelnikov's atlas, a terrible deficit at the time. In a strange 3-volume book were drawn with amazing accuracy all the smallest details of bone, muscle, and nerve tissue, which sometimes allowed not to run at the slightest occasion to his son in the institute to view the preparations. Andrew began to live up to expectations and quickly rose to the top of his class. Unfortunately, elsewhere he was not even in the top 10. After lectures and practical classes at uni, he spent late hours honestly cramming Latin terms in the small kitchen. His mother went to bed early in the room. First session was passed with straight A's. This is an increased scholarship. There was more. Andrew had only 1 B on his report card. He was on his way to a red diploma. And then came what is called the difficulty of choice. What profession to choose? After all, you can become anything. Andrew had a rich choice, but his psyche was stable, though all the departments tore him apart. The term of study was over half. Everyone wanted a smart and savvy young man. In ophthalmology, the grandmother professor simply adored and drew and saw him as nothing less than a glorified Jacko. And in fact, now you could get rich on cataract lens replacement surgeries alone. I wish I'd known. The obstetrics and gynecology teacher looked at Andrew with bated hope. He alone could correctly rotate the fetus in the prone position and pull the baby out. Yes, on a fake. So what? He could do it in practice. A madam teacher of a complicated subject, social hygiene and organization of public health. They used to study that too. Considered the adolescent a future luminary. He was the only one who knew a pile of absolute and relative data and could put all that nonsense down on paper. The rest of the team simply amicably wrote it all off. I must say that beautiful Betty also used Andrew as much as possible, especially since he did not mind at all. She quickly figured out that Andrew was looking for the slightest excuse to communicate with her and began to make small requests. The more so that Andrew complied with great joy. Besides, one should not restrain the impulses that come from the soul. So says a clever proverb. And with the young man, everything came from the heart. Because of the small family budget, Andrew from early childhood worked part-time. The money in the family was chronically insufficient. Therefore, in his first year, he immediately got a job in the clinic of urology. Because of his lack of experience, he was hired only as a hospital attendant, which was not bad at all. They began to save less money. After the 3rd year, the hard-working orderly with a steady reputation was transferred to the position of nurse. And after today's lecture, he had to go on night duty. Betty thought for a while. It was not in her nature to think too much, and asked to be on duty with Andrew. No, don't think anything of it. They didn't even kiss. It was just that he, after all, the procedures and manipulations, was writing the girls' case histories, which began to be assigned in almost every subject. This happened after she, a beautiful and intelligent, publicly ridiculed in a practical lesson on surgery, and her self-esteem was hurt, and that was unacceptable. Here's the thing. In the past, many yards on the streets dried laundry, and someone, having washed a beret, hung it to dry and put a smooth, rather large stone inside, apparently mistakenly believing that it would give the beret the desired shape. The patient who Betty got to write her medical history decided to take a shortcut and went straight through the laundry, and of course hit her forehead on the beret. That's what she wrote in the medical report. He hit his head on a beret that was drying, and it was necessary to write beautifully, as during examination of the place of incident, with a corpse lying on the floor, he received trauma of the frontal area from a blow with a blunt object. Since then, after grabbing sandwiches for 2, Betty started going to the urology clinic with Andrew. By the way, they both enjoyed this nightly cozy pastime. Funny Andrew suddenly proved to be a pleasant and witty conversationalist. They drank coffee. He needed to stay awake at his post. And the girl, for company, coffee had an unusual effect on her. Such people are known to be about 20%. For some reason, they have not only narrowed cerebral arteries, but also dilated veins, into which the blood flows away from the arteries. A pharmacological paradox, no less. As a result, after coffee, Betty would pass out and sleep, and very soundly. Andrew laid the girl in the treatment room where everything was sterile. At night, the bosses did not go there. Betty lay down on the couch and covered herself with a robe. That was enough. One early morning, a young professor came into the office. Why he had been brought in so early, no one knew. Awakened by the noise, sleepy Betty, seeing the professor, quickly sat up, lowered her feet in white socks, for the night tights were necessarily removed, and said, "Good morning, Professor." He said nothing, stood there and went out. We waited for a scandal for a few days, but for some reason it did not happen. On the contrary, the teacher began to treat Andrew with more respect, with emphasis on the O. And today the young man was expected to be on duty together. The girl, on the other hand, was not bothered by the fact that she was breaking someone else's heart. She was enjoying herself, and that was the most important thing. After all, everything in the world was happening to provide her with comfort and pleasure. Although, who put all this into the beautiful head of a young nymph from a provincial village remained a mystery. Betty decided to go to learn to be a doctor at the request of her elderly grandmother, who treated the whole village. And, as we would say now, with a positive effect. What made the patients feel better? It is difficult to say. Maybe from the outlandish potions and herbs she collected with her own hands. Maybe from a kind word which is pleasant even to a cat. Or from my grandmother's good aura. But all in combination brought unprecedented results. It was certainly a gift from God. Talent is said to be passed down through the generations. It turned out that it was God's will for Betty to study medicine in the city. So she began to try her luck. It was the end of her 4th year. Yes, Betty was from out of town. And she didn't come from a rich family. But her parents struggled to maintain the image of their beloved daughter, though perhaps they did not know such a word. They did everything necessary to ensure that the beloved girl did not need anything. They raised livestock and chickens, as the mother said, selling milk and meat. And when her daughter received tasty packages, the whole dormitory gathered in her room. The parents were oligarchs, no less. They sent such delicious things. By the way, it was Betty who slipped such expressions, which she explained to the astonished people around her by her love of Old Russian. It should be noted that the beautiful student had a problem with ordinary Russian, a solid 3. It is believed that certain cretinism, mathematical, geographical, or Russian, language arrivical or Russian language, arises from the simple underdevelopment of certain areas of the brain. Apparently, something similar happened to Betty, but it didn't spoil her at all. Besides, the drafts of the medical history were written by the clever and literate Andrew. And it's not hard to rewrite already. Made text, but in general the girl was clever. Andrew simply would not pay attention to another one, but with ambition. After all, she deserved a better fate. What else could it be? It was not for nothing that such beauty blossomed, only to make someone happy. Madame Beatty knew how to wait, and honestly waited for her knight on a white horse, mixing the waiting with trips to discos and parties, where she always had success. And it could not be otherwise. As slender, with a mop of blonde hair and blue eyes, she attracted like a magnet, and a potential husband is sure to appear. It seems that already can be heard stomping and inviting barking. And meanwhile, carefree student life in the dorm, where everything is common, the face and clothes and soul and thoughts. I think that's what Anton Pavlovich Chekhov wrote, and of course parcels with quality provisions from my parents. Oligarchs. Oligarchs. The day after the duty, the group decided to go to a cafe to celebrate the imminent completion of the 4th year. Yes, it was nearing exam time. The credits were almost passed. Betty was in good spirits. Thanks to Andrew, she had managed to finish the course tolerably well. All the credits she needed were almost past. It remained to prepare well for the exams. And not only that, she had to get to the right teacher. During the winter session, at the exam on hygiene, the girl came across a strange aunt. At first glance, an ordinary gray mouse. Betty perfectly solved the problem about the temperature and air pressure in the cockpit of an airplane at a certain altitude and simply reeled off the answers to the 4 questions. The mouse teacher silently and impassively looked at her and gave her a 2. Without a word, without asking a single question. The girl fell into a stupor, did not clarify anything, and left silently too. Perhaps the teacher was a moral sadist and just had her share of fun. Or a social psychopath. The basics of psychiatry were beginning to emerge. Betty got a C on her retake, surprising her uncle professor with the knowledge she had settled in 3 weeks. The vacations were very long, but it wasn't customary to give her more than a C on her retake. But she was going to pass this session well. A shell never lands twice in the same funnel. Back at the dormitory, Betty, sleeping on the couch in the treatment room, began to dress up. For her, a girl who had grown up in a relatively remote rural area, going to a cafe was an event. And, besides, it would be a chance, or a chance, as her father used to say, because that was where the long-awaited prince might stop by for some lunch or a bite to eat. Otherwise, where would the rumbling come from? Betty thoughtfully wore a skirt, with a top to show off her pretty shoulders. The weather was extraordinary, as the classic wrote, and in this heat the top was entirely appropriate. In short, the goods on her face. She wore a velvet pendant around her neck. It seemed that Kitty had such a velvet pendant on her first ball, and she expected a lot from it, and Betty, like Kitty, felt what that velvet was saying. A high school student, Betty hadn't read Anna Karenina, but she felt the adornment would be perfectly appropriate. The image was completed with a minimum of makeup, loose hair, the color of ripe wheat, and a red handbag. It was supposed to be a bright accent in Betty's image and bring him a much-needed twist. All these tips can now be found on the internet. The girl came up with everything herself. Oh yes, and light shoes to match the bag. The program of the party was supposed to dance. Schmancy. Charmers. Betty looked at herself in the big muddy mirror on the second-floor landing and realized that she was fabulously good-looking. Someone was going to be very lucky tonight. The cafe was already abuzz with excitement. Almost the entire group was there except for one student. Yes, that was Andrew. After a sleepless night, he went home. He, unlike Betty, had not slept on duty. And besides, nothing, as the saying goes, was a harbinger of things to come. If only one knew. So, ignorant Andrew slept peacefully, carefully covered by a loving mother, and had a pleasant dream. He and his beloved Betty were walking through the night town. A huge moon was shining brightly in the dark sky, not a soul around, and they were kissing. It was like a birthday party. Andrew was smacking his lips in his sleep, even smacking slightly. If the young man thought a little about the interpretation of a wonderful, at first glance, dream, he would have realized that nothing good was expected in his nearest life. The dark time of day meant darkness in his soul. The dark time of day meant danger, and a huge moon meant you know what. And kissing in general meant a quarrel. All this was written in my grandmother's old dream book. My mother only used it. But the realist Andrew believed in omens and all sorts of superstitions. In his opinion, such a dream boded only good things. Perhaps on the next watch, the girl would allow herself to be kissed. But the next watch, Betty did not come. In the evening, Andrew suddenly woke up and sat down. His heart thumped in his throat, then snapped and fell somewhere down. At that time, a new visitor entered the cafe, where the young people were walking. There was nothing special about it. The man disregarded tea and equally coffee, and immediately took the bull by the horns. He approached Betty and asked her to dance. Since most of the students in the group were girls, everyone tried to dance only fast dances. Jumping together was not so offensive. Another thing, slow dance. This time, the beauty did not get a gentleman, and the man was very handy. A tenacious, rustic look quickly picked out all that was needed. Expensive boots, watches, and teeth, and a suit that few people wore these days. Apparently, it was really something worthwhile. The horse's neighing became clearer, and the girl stood up. Ah, what a dance that was! The man held Jana to him as if he had every right to do so. Gently and at the same time, somehow masterly, and she felt something hitherto unknown to her. Perhaps it was the proverbial butterflies in the stomach, about which now shouted from every iron. The man was wearing a delicate scent of expensive perfume. A very young boy was singing Edamo's song Snow, falling in a piercing and very similar way. The sun was shining brightly through the open door, and the cafe was in semi-darkness. And altogether, it was what is called soiree intimacy, despite the oodles of people around and the light of day. Just for the two of them, the snow was falling and the sun was shining. The dance was over, and the musicians left for a break, and they stood there, unable to tear themselves away from each other. It was, if we believe the writer Bunin and his work of the same name, sunstroke. In addition, the newfound beau had a huge plus. There was nothing on his ring finger. Hooray for 3 times. It's easy to guess what followed. They danced a couple more dances, and a man, who introduced himself as Oliver, offered to escort young Yanka, whose charms, of course, attracted him, and it was perfectly natural. At that moment the stars rose a little bit differently, and the cards were lying in a way that predicted the love of the king of clubs. Oliver was a brunette, and the cards won't lie. This had been foretold to Betty that night by her roommate, the ugly Diana, who took a fortune-teller's fee. Student Betty joyfully poured her friend food for many days to come. She absolutely did not want to eat. After all, lovers are known to eat very little. And if they do, then very little. A few breadcrumbs and all drinking scarce food solely with flower nectar. Yes, Betty has fallen in love. Like the classic in Onegin, the time has come and she has fallen in love. Besides, there were no obstacles to it. He was free. It was only later she would discover that he had a fiancée in parallel, much better than she, and her mother-in-law, Oliver's mother, would tell her that. In the meantime, the summer heat, the nights swimming together, the walks and kisses, she will remember them for the rest of her life. They, exhausted by the anticipation of love, clung greedily to each other and drank the juices of life, comprehending the flavors, aromas, and extraordinary delights of a real kiss. Yes, Betty had learned how to kiss properly, and more often she covered the marks that appeared on her lips with bright lipstick. But as time passed, it became clear that kissing alone would not do the trick, especially since they both wanted it. The time between the first meeting and that passed just nothing. Everything happened on a bunk in a dormitory, when kind girlfriends left her and her sweetheart alone. To be sure, the stern janitor was placated with a chocolate bar. Baba Selina, not accustomed to such exertions and dealing only with poor students, melted, and every time, and this began to happen with enviable regularity, happily nodded to Betty, hiding the cherished candy in a pocket of a blue robe. It must be said that two-faced Janus Vitalik was not at all bothered by the situation, and he was fine with it. The summer passed like that, during which the lovers parted briefly. My lover went away on business, as he had a big business. The student planned to practice as a paramedic in a nearby village. There were numerous calls and long conversations about love and future prospects. By the way, the businessman did not prevent Jaina from talking openly about their future wedding, although he had other relationships going on in parallel, and also towards the wedding. After all, before the appearance of Betty, Oliver already had a bride in his life. The girl was in a sweet delirium of dreams and reverie, especially since Vitali had rented an apartment and she had moved out of the dormitory in early fall. Often he stayed overnight, and then it was not an evening but a real night of love waiting for them. Betty hardly ever talked to Andrew. It was not a good time. And about what? Especially since he, too, had become clearly aloof from her. And if he happened to participate in general conversation, he either looked away or averted his eyes. There were rumors that his mother was ill, but Betty was not before Andrew and his mother. Her stomach began to move. She had to go to the doctor, and there the frightened girl learned that she was 4 months pregnant and that it was too late to have an abortion. How so? You ask, and you would be absolutely right. In the village, parents had no time to teach their daughter the basics of sexuality and means of protection, and the beautiful Yanka was not even embarrassed by the obvious malfunction of some organs. She, at one time, skipped almost all classes on gynecology. In Oliver's opinion, it was the woman, and only she, who should think about protection. Therefore, he was absolutely sure that the medical student had taken care of everything. She had, after all, gone into her 5th year. After all, you'd have to be a complete fool, too. That's what her mother-in-law, Oliver's mother, would tell Betty later. In the evening, coming from the doctor, Betty called up her lover, although it was not his day, and snapping voice said happy news, which did not fit into her plans. We will soon be happy parents. We will soon be happy parents, you hear, honey? Cavalier unexpectedly rejoiced. And why not? He was already very used to Betty. They were a beautiful couple. There was nothing wrong with intimate life. Infatuation gave way to an even feeling, and Vitalik decided to tie his life to the girl. So he decided not to hesitate any longer because he too was tortured with this very difficulty of choice. It was urgent to get married before the belly grew. That's what the old-fashioned village mother and father used to say. But Vitalik calmed me down. Say, look, even now it is fashionable. As it turned out, my future husband was right. Many people did not hide their stomachs, but even bragged about it, especially the elite, the bohemians, and the so-called self-appointed stars. Though I really wanted to ask, who were all these people? Before the wedding, we had to meet the parents. First, the groom took Janka to his. Betty was twitching like a pig on a rope. The businessman said he had a strict mother. She dressed up decently, didn't put makeup on. You never know. They bought a cake for tea and flowers for mother and went to the address indicated in the place of registration. The Blossoms lived in a big 3-room flat, well furnished. The bride understood at once that her father and mother from the village would not like her in-laws. And when she pictured Oliver's parents in her parents' co-ed tiny bathroom, which Daddy called a shingle, she felt sick. But she was worried for nothing. It didn't come to that. The mother-in-law. To be refused to see Betty's parents. But more about that later. The fact that she did not like the girl herself. Not how she imagined the future wife of her only son. Just as in the cartoon about the ring. The dog Zuzha and the cat Maha. Marus disliked a snake-eared hedgehog. Only in the role of the snake here was a student named Betty. What's more, Betty didn't like her a priori, long before the groom's mother saw her. When you're getting married, it seems like the love of the groom is what counts. And his mother is not the main thing. And this opinion is completely wrong. How many families have been ruined by mothers-in-law? And how many have been prevented from happening? For example, Justin's mother, Elizabeth, a wonderful actress. To marry her son had to only those whom she approved of, and to cross her mother-folk artist. A nice, gentle Justin. Just could not. Therefore, do not think that the mixture or dissolve. It is possible to develop into a chronic, complicated inflammation. Yes, my mother did not approve of Janka right away. To begin with the fact that she did not go out to meet guests. In the hallway stomped one dad, through dressed in a bow tie. Probably wanted to impress the future daughter. In law? In principle, it was the first bell. Or rather, not a bell, but a bell, an alarm, a siren, and so's or air raid alarm. It was necessary to pick up a hymn. Betty on this occasion put on a midi-skirt and urgently run back to the dormitory as a favorite Katya Tikhomirova from the movie about Moscow, which does not believe in tears. But it was no longer about her, but about another person. The embryo was gradually turning into a human being, and the girl stayed. The evening, by the way, went well. In half an hour, my mother appeared in a silk robe Times of the Nep. I'm sick. What am I? Not people. With the advent of Mom, a striking change occurred with my dad. He somehow wilted, bored, and deflated. It became clear who was here to turn the head. So depicted the future father. In law, the conversation, like a flickering firelight, floundered and jumped from subject to subject. Yes, there were options, but the theme was the same. The son's future wife and her lowly kin. Contempt oozed in every word. The in-laws were so worthless that they were not invited to their own daughter's wedding. Here, too, Betty was a coward, and she kept her mouth shut, but all her life she felt that she had betrayed her parents. Only Blossom's numerous relatives and 3 classmates were hanging out in the restaurant lounge rented for this purpose. To Betty's surprise, she saw student Andrew among the guests. Andrew had undergone a slight change during this time. Due to the intense feelings associated with the loss of love, he had lost a lot of weight. Moreover, the thick glasses had disappeared. Now she was faced with a young man of good looks. She had ceased to be interested in the life of the group lately. She was not interested in what was going on in the institute, but in what was in her belly. Her stomach, on the other hand, was fine. The baby tapped periodically in the front abdominal wall, making itself known. And now her belly, covered with a ruffle of white guipure with flowers attached to it, was squirming mischievously, as if to say, "I hope everything goes well." Betty, however, heard rumors that Andrew had enrolled in the surgical club, where they had long been trying to get him. She also learned that his mother had been diagnosed with cancer. The new spouse was afraid her ex-boyfriend was going to get into it, but it didn't work out. He sat silently all evening in a corner, not looking at the happiness of the young couple, splashing in all directions. Why he came was still a mystery, and Betty would try to find out later. She would get the dance, but she would not succeed. Probably wanted to make sure that there would be no going back to the past. After the wedding, the young couple stayed in the very apartment that Vitalik rented for Betty. Although her mother-in-law repeatedly offered to move into a 3-room apartment, the mother, to be prudently refused. Family life world spun, brought a lot of joy and some disappointment. It turned out that her husband, a very busy man, and he has absolutely no time to do the housework. This was somewhat unexpected. It was not what Betty, who was used to the joys of parenthood together, had expected. It was when, for better or for worse, in feast and in peace, and in good people, only together. Here it turned out that everything around the house should be done by a woman. By the way, and to protect herself too. And it was popularly explained to her. Yes, the husband did it, but, as they say, accompanied by a beloved and loving mother. She was now always present in their lives. But there was one big problem. It wasn't Betty's mother. It was someone else's aunt. And her parents still sent weighty parcels of food, only to a different address. And no one in the friendly Blossom family refused them, though, in the girl's opinion, they should have. Pregnancy was well tolerated by Betty. Once she threw up in practice, and that was it. No more toxicosis or stupid desires. Strawberries fay, ho or manga, as Betty's mother called the overseas fruit. I want manga, and I want it now. There is such a thing as a pregnant woman's whim. Pregnant student Blossom was completely devoid of any whims. In general, after the wedding, the girl has changed. She had somehow grown serious, laughed less, could remain silent for long periods of time, and began to be content with very little. This, of course, explained many things. She was now a married lady, and it wasn't at all appropriate for her to cackle with her girlfriends, as her father-in-law Dustin, as her roots were deep in the region, had said. But perhaps something had become clear to her. What had once been covered by a glossy and beautiful facade of total well-being had become brazenly outward. But, as the saying goes, it's too late to drink the Borjami when your kidneys have failed. All the burdens of family life fell on the fragile shoulders of the student. By the way, she had to finish her studies and pass her first semester exams. And she finished her studies and passed, though she might not have studied at all. Her belly had reached its critical size by then. The baby promised to be big. In such cases, teachers would give female students B's, and everyone went their separate ways without stressing each other out. After exams, Betty took a sabbatical. The birth was 2 months away. The contractions started 2 weeks ahead of schedule. She wasn't an excellent student, but she knew that contractions lasted a long time for first-time mothers, and therefore the start of contractions shown in the movies and the frantic fuss of calling an ambulance and running around made her genuinely resentful. Which was perfectly fair. Apparently not everyone playing in the movie knew the subtleties. And to a professional, of course, that was obvious. It was about 6 in the morning. Betty had honestly been up for an hour, letting her lover sleep in before the day's work. It was still bearable. At 7, he woke up. They gathered leisurely, and he had a hearty breakfast beforehand. Management is not a pound of raisins. Only then called an ambulance. At the maternity hospital, it turned out that the girl had a narrow pelvis and a large fetus. Why they noticed it only now, it is not clear. But people are just people. Yes, the culprit was what today is called the human factor. Surgery loomed ahead. At 5 o'clock in the evening. What a fateful number. Betty, stupefied with pain, consented. All the more so because she had already seen enough of the charms of childbirth on duty. There seemed to be no end in sight, and the anesthesia was not of such high quality. The operation resulted in the birth of a beautiful baby girl, 51 centimeters tall and weighing 300, named after Rose's mother-in-law. Returning home, weakened Betty realized that she alone cannot cope. Help from a young father was not the word completely. He was always away at work. Money, however, was plentiful. The ideal solution was to go to her own mother, but her mother-in-law categorically rejected it. What good can teach a child from an intelligent family? A village grandmother, and Betty was silent again. It turned out that the mother-in-law was right. Nothing. So moved to the second mother. I remember in the 90s there was a great show about the mother-in-law, called My Second Mom. It was at the very beginning. The audience was completely unspoiled, so they were glued to their TV sets. But the mother-in-law there was a good one, the kind you only see in movies. But in fact, it turned out a little different. In real life, this same second mother began to immediately try to remake everything differently, or rather, in his own way, because it wasn't done the way it was supposed to be done. It's not nice, that's all. That's not how Beatty fed, drank, squeezed, cleaned her ears, and so on and so forth. And of course, it wasn't how she cleaned the apartment. Who could argue this was especially true when it came to cleaning the toilets? I must say that despite the presence of finances in the house, good jobs for both spouses, and unlimited credit for her son, Maria was flatly against the quite constructive idea of inviting someone from the outside to clean, although crowds of such people could have come to the Blossom's apartment at any time, and with great pleasure, cleaned everything to a shine. But this did not happen. The mother-in-law simply could not allow her favorite toilet to be touched by other people's hands. This reassured our heroine a little. Maria was allowed to clean the toilet at any time. So she wasn't a stranger. At least some positive. It wasn't hard to imagine who had to clean the apartment. It took turns being cleaned by Betty and the uncomplaining Dustin. The father-in-law had it easier. and he was clearly schlonging, pouring bleach where he could, and not washing the corners. So, on a young mother's watch, she had to clean up his messes too. Betty had lost weight and she had grown gaunt. She kept expecting her mother-in-law to run into the room at any moment and run her finger over some surface and say, "Did you not wipe the dust again?" Only on TV and in comedy programs such jokes about dusting. 'Cause Homeric laughter. By the way, my mother could come into the room at any time, showing who the mistress of the house. Moreover, Mom herself hated to rub the stove and burners. So said Betty's favorite dad. She wanted very much to get away to a rented apartment, but the girl did not sleep well, and her mother-in-law often took her to her place at night so that, no, not Betty, but her son-in-law, not Betty, but her son-in-law, could get some sleep before the day's work. After all, the daughter-in-law, according to Maria Sergeyevna, could sleep during the day at any time. It was clear that the woman was in trouble. In addition, she got the feeling that the friendly Blossom family was just waiting for her. The fool from the lane of Indira Gandhi, where the Leonidos had been registered. That's how they lived. Everything obeyed the mother-in-law with a royal name. By the way, they named their daughter after her, but it did not help. Before choosing a name, the girl tried to object, but she was promised by an oath that the very next child would certainly be named after her dear relative. The only joy was her daughter, a blue-eyed beauty with tugs on her chubby arms and legs, like on a modern diaper ad. The feeling of discomfort was compounded by the fact that over time her mother-in-law began to look at Janja suspiciously. She was perplexed. What else? And one day my mother said, "Something I do not see any resemblance to my dear son, and why the granddaughter has blonde hair when my son, burly brunette." The young mother, who was not expecting such an obvious disgrace, tried to appeal to reason and stuttered about the science of genetics and the possibility of changing the color of hair with age. But my mother-in-law, who had spent most of her life behind a drawing board, was unaware of arguments about dominant and recessive traits. Obviously, this very center was underdeveloped in her brain. It did not work to wrestle the second mother into a normal relationship. But it didn't end there. And harmful Maria began to return more often to the subject that was bothering her, to make bold assumptions, to calculate terms, and to compare habitus. What in Latin means appearance? What in Latin means appearance? Habitus was not to be compared, and it appeared that Rose's granddaughter was not Oliver's own daughter. The husband had laughed at first. There was no doubt in his mind that she was their love child, but as they say, the water chisels the stone. With an emphasis on O, and the water began to make little holes in Oliver's mind, which gradually turned into gaps, and already a worm of doubt settled in them. Mother, seeing that her crops were sprouting, pressed on. More than anything, she wanted to divorce her son from that impudent village girl who had given birth to a fool of her own, by who knows whom. And then he would find himself a suitable couple. The second mother decided to hit for sure and offered to take a DNA test to establish paternity. Jana was offended, but slightly. She hadn't expected anything good from her mother-in-law in a long time. Everything. Very simple. You need to collect samples of epithelium from the inner surface of the baby's cheeks and the alleged father. She said so, the bastard, then take everything to the genetics lab and wait. And Betty, of course, agreed. There could be no doubt about it. Rose was Blossom for sure. But man supposes and God disposes. And the result stunned everyone but her mother-in-law. She knew all beforehand. Paternity was out of the question. "I told you," Maria raged in her daughter-in-law's clean kitchen. She had a baby, and you naked. Vitalik, who had not expected such a clear meanness from the woman, whom he loved in his own way, completely slumped and looked at his mother with a beaten look. She was right, after all, and not in vain warned. See how it turned out. There was nothing to hide. Betty was so clear it hurt my eyes. The explanation was straightforward. The expert geneticist had simply been paid off, no less. As a result, she and someone else's pup were put out on the street, in the spring weather with temperature fluctuations. She stood with her stuff and Rose in her arms outside the doorway, waiting for them to come to their senses and apologize. What a naive Chukchi girl. Not quite Chukchi girl, not quite Chukchi, but very naive. True, the father-in-law came out. The young mother's heart sank. There it is. So there is justice in the world. But her expectations were not met. Father-in-law silently gave her a package of diapers. Say, we do not need someone else's, and left. There were no tears. The woman cried when things were not so bad, and on occasions like this she just froze. The daughter began to tossing and turning. Something had to be done, and Betty came up with nothing better than to go to her old dorm. Maybe they would let her stay overnight, especially since the dorm was only 2 streetcar stops away. Of course they let her in. And although the time of welfare and chocolates ended, a kind janitor allowed a couple of days in the old room. It was by then empty. And then, my dear, you can do it on your own. The commandant is too strict. By the evening of the second day, her dorm term was up. At 5 o'clock in the evening, when Betty was packing, her friends had promised to help with renting. Andrew suddenly burst into the room. No one canceled the wireless telegraph. And, as the main character played by Alexei Batalov in the movie Big Family, began to make attempts to take the girl with his daughter. Not anywhere, and home to her mother. Note to go to her mother. Note to go to her mother. Note to go to her mother. Even a very good, it was just not to stand. Then Andrew quickly left, asking her to wait. Betty managed it easily. There was nowhere to go anyway. A couple of hours later, inspired Andrew showed up and happily announced that he had managed to rent a small apartment and even paid a deposit, so we could move in right away. There was nothing to do. We moved in. Late that night, for the first time in a long time, Betty slept peacefully, not fearing that now burst into the room hated mother-in-law to check whether her favorite son had enough blankets. It happened. Rose was snoozing soundly next to her. The apartment was small, but very cozy. The Blossoms were quickly separated. Mother and son proved that Rose had nothing to do with the family. And time flowed, partly backwards. Andrew started coming in every day after work. The girl caught herself thinking that she was really looking forward to his visits. They began to huddle in the little kitchen, like they used to do in the urology department in that very recent and so distant time. And they reminisced and reminisced. To make enough money for everyone, Andrew took a job as an ambulance paramedic. It required a lot of physical exertion, so he lost a few more kilos. Suddenly he cut his hair short, which suited him very well, and he turned into a kind of macho, brutal, and charismatic. So one evening, the former Madame Blossom did not want the student emeritus to leave, which was only natural, and he stayed with all the ensuing consequences, which unexpectedly turned out to be very pleasant. 10 years passed. One day, in the urological department, where the young doctor of medical sciences Alexander worked, a complicated patient was admitted with an attack. After examination, it became clear that an operation was required. It was absolutely impossible to wait, because the patient's life was in danger. A stone coming out from the kidney provoked an internal bleeding. Because of the complexity of the situation, Alexander decided to operate himself. He liked these complicated cases. After all, they all resolved very well, and the young doctor had no punctures. His eyes looked sharp, picking out the slightest pathology on the operating field. The brain reacted quickly, processing the incoming impulses into clear movements of the scalpel, which was firmly held by trained, reliable hands. Yes, it was Andrew's ex, who was hard to recognize. So different. Alexander did not immediately recognize the patient either. But after a closer look, he realized that it was Betty's former mother-in-law, who had been in charge of everything at her son's wedding. It was she, along with her beloved son, kicked a young mother and baby out of the house. Of course, her husband knew all the details of her personal life. You guessed it. They got married. After all, water chisel stone. Maria? Indeed, it was difficult to recognize. The bed was an old, tired woman with a poker face. When she starts to get up, it will be clear that the former article too, no, sick of course, did not remember the representative doctor standing in front of her. At her son's wedding, she did not pay much attention to her village daughter-in-law's friends. They just did not deserve it. Besides, she was now in painful shock. The surgery went well, and it couldn't have gone any other way. That's how Dr. Andrew had all his surgeries. In the evening, while filling out his medical history, Alexander paid attention to the personal data, and he was struck by the patient's position and place of work. A cleaner in a cafe. Apparently something unknowable and not entirely pleasant was going on in the life of the former Betty mother-in-law. In the evening, over dinner, Andrew, and that was his only name now, told his beloved Betty about this strange encounter. And she suddenly wanted to visit her former mother-in-law. And why not? After all, happy people are generous. And Betty Andrew was a very happy woman. Besides, it was very easy to do. She worked in the same department as a consultant because patients were supposed to be seen by a therapist before surgery. And that's exactly what Betty became, and a very good one too. She had to match her husband in every way. By the way, she had 2 examinations scheduled for tomorrow in urology. Loving Andrew didn't mind that Betty worked with him in the same department. In fact, they had coffee and sandwiches together at work, just like they used to, only it was during the day. Alexander no longer took night duty. Operating maids were entitled to a pretty good salary and did not have to work hard at night. Maria, who did not expect to see her former daughter-in-law slut, was embarrassed and blushed. She did not want to appear in front of Betty like that. The other girl, on the other hand, was confident. She'd changed so much, too. She'd turned into a beautiful girl who knew her own worth. She'd never looked like the same girl she'd always been, which, with a husband like that, was only natural. There was nothing left of the old mother-in-law either. Sobbing and blowing her nose minute by minute, she told a rather sad story. After a divorce, Vitaly has not found anyone. A worthy candidate for the post of favorite wife was not. Why did you, Yanochka, from him? Oh, in vain. Such a beautiful couple. And what a granddaughter, Rose, what a berry. And the face, a look just like Vitaly. Being free, my son had plenty of time. Vitalik, loving and beloved, was more than happy to help his parents at the cottage. One evening they drove the seedlings together with his father. Dustin was at the wheel, clinking a shot for warmth, so Daddy Leonidov said. The result was like with the actor Tom. Only here the father-in-law and ex-husband suffered. Father-in-law left for the next world. There was nobody to spin him, and his son broke his cervical spine and became disabled of the first group. He is in a wheelchair and needs constant care. Betty, a medical student, was aware of the disability groups. This is what Maria told Jana, interspersing her speech with frequent sobs. She could see that something was bothering her, apart from her current status. After all, in the second half of life, a person begins to assess her past actions in a completely different way, and everything became so clear to the former mother-in-law that it hurt her eyes. What a clever proverb. And she cracked. But there was nothing new for Betty. Yes, her mother-in-law had falsified the DNA results, but she had guessed that before. And of course, long ago forgave the second mother. Do not forget her generosity. Here the former daughter-in-law unconsciously finished former mother-in-law, saying that the operation was conducted by her husband, a doctor of science, to whom all the patients wanted to get. My God, what an unpredictable fate. And after all, at first nothing foretold, and maybe try to renew the relationship. After all, Vitaly always loved only one Yanochka, but the former daughter-in-law did not even want to hear about it. Maria tried to hug goodbye, but she coldly refused. The visit to her mother-in-law left a bad taste in Betty's soul. She needed something to please herself with, and she decided to go shopping to buy Delilah a new dress for the kindergarten graduation party. Yep, you guessed it. The couple had a daughter in common, and unlike Rose, she showed up the usual way. By the way, the stitches on her abdomen were good and didn't come undone during her pregnancy, and they named her after Jana's mom, Tanya. So, that was a dream come true. In the evening, she and Andrew were discussing everything that had happened lately. Suddenly, her husband suggested that I talk to Evan. He should help. Evan was Professor Evan, a luminary in the field of neurosurgery. With him and Andrew played tennis on Fridays. Andrew was also generous. No wonder. He and his wife had everything in common, and happiness too. That was exactly what Betty had dreamed of before. It was done for a start. Betty went to her ex-husband to find out what was going on, just in case. Things were very sad there too. Thank goodness he wasn't a drunk, but everything else left a lot to be desired. A dead apartment, shabby furnishings, and the notorious goanna, which in her apartment had once been so ashamed of Betty. And in vain. In a room of this category, nothing else was supposed to be. At the sight of Oliver, Betty felt nothing but disgust. To think that she had once loved kissing that man. And not only, yes, she had taken her daughter to meet her father. They had decided that together with Andrew, Rose to get acquainted with the biological father, condescended, but did not show themselves in any way. A strange stranger uncle with a disability did not touch her. Vitalik was also not very eager to continue the relationship. He treated his daughter as a stranger's girl. Her mother stood her ground like a burned Giordano Bruno for a long time. We talked, and the ex-husband agreed. Quickly, they gave the matter the necessary acceleration, and everything spun. Under the quota, Evan had a complicated surgery and freed the nerves crushed by the splintered vertebrae after the accident. After proper rehabilitation, Oliver could even walk. Yes, with a cane. The story comes to its logical conclusion. And in it, as it should be, justice triumphs. And life will slowly go back to normal. Recovered vitally, and his mother will buy a small house and move into the village, to the free bread. After all, to have a subsistence farming in our time, much more profitable. In addition, the mother will suddenly and irrevocably believe in God, and this can only be welcomed. Without faith, life has no meaning. Andrew's family will be fine too, and soon there will be a third baby daughter. That everything goes according to classical literature and the magic number 3, like Pushkin when the 3 maidens were spinning under the window in the late evening, or in Chekhov. There 3 sisters strove together in Moscow, the capital of our motherland. After all, if you believe today's programs, it was a rubber. Yes, and named the 3rd daughter, of course, in honor of her mother. But not the mother of that obese Andrew, but after the recovered mother of Alexander Andrew. Is it possible to imagine anything else? Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.